We're going to try to finish finally this chapter. This is the seventh chapter, the seventh class on this chapter. So we left off last week was based on that question which the Alter Rebbe asks: why is pikuach nefesh deicher kol haTorah kula, which means why is the din, the halacha, that one has to violate an aveira when it comes to a situation, a state of life or death, and if his life is threatened, he has to violate. He must violate the Aveda. We give an example. Someone tells somebody, "Open the light to Shabbos, and if not, I'll take your life." You gotta open the light. And instead, the only Aveda is the exclusion of the big three, which is Gilarei, idolatry, adultery, and murder. We'll explain this in the previous weeks. So, what was the question? The question was, if the Alter Rebbe explains over here that essentially, virtually every single Aveda is about idolatry, with a whole beer, with a whole explanation of the previous weeks and the previous classes in this previous and so why is it that for that Aveda, for that sin, which is the sin of idolatry, one has to give up his life, and for every any other sin he doesn't have to give his life? Manavshach means to say you can't cut the candles, and he say you can't cut two ends. You can't cut the candle at both ends. You can't say one hand it has the same severity and the same gravity like Avodah Zarah. On the other hand, no, Avodah Zarah, you have to give up your life. And this, I have to give up my life. Maybe it doesn't have the same gravity. Where's the balance? Like, what's going on? Or what's the truth? Is it like Avodah Zarah? It's not. And if it is, it should be all the way. So Alter Rebbe explains over here that really it is exactly like Avodah, not exactly. This is Avodah Zarah. It is idolatry. It is virtually idolatry when someone comes in front of a sin. It's about thou shalt not have any other gods in the presence of my face. And when it comes to mitzvah, it is Anochi Hashem Elokecha. Is it about I am Hashem your God? Based on the entire explanation of the previous weeks, that we could all go back. Everybody is invited to go back if you missed the class to the previous. Find it on tanyaonline.com, additional to the Kosher Tube, which is the premier disseminator of Torah. You have this particular class on tanyaonline.com with the advantage. That's why I said this website is because it has the text. And you can see the beautiful explanation of Alter Rebbe explaining us step by step why every sin ultimately does have the gravity, or is about idolatry. So why is it by idolatry one has to give up his life and all the other sins he doesn't? So Alter Rebbe explains over here that really it doesn't something which you cannot. It's not something which you can rationalize. It's not something which makes sense. It doesn't begin to make sense. Which means why Hashem decided this, this no. This one must give up his life and this not. And you don't have to give up your life. It's not something which we could comprehensively understand. It's Exeris HaKasav. It's an edict of the verse. Hashem decided this, this no. Don't try to make sense of it. Why he decided, that's what he decided. And he brings a proof, according to Nigla, we had last week, a clear proof that it's not based on rationale. Right? Regarding the Shochet. When it comes to Shechita, if he's Mumr l'Shabbos, and which Shabbos is not one of the three, and if he is indifferent to the Aved of Shabbos, his Shechita, his slaughtering, is considered a trefa slaughtering. It's considered unkosher. As opposed to if he's somebody who's indifferent to one of the three big sins, which one does have to give his life, which is Gilarei, it's adultery, his shechita is kosher. How does that work? If it's just something that based on the three avedas, the sins, the three big sins, which we have to give up our life, it should have been the opposite. Again, you could all see it in the previous classes. So Alter Rebbe brings a clear proof based on the Alpi Nigla, based on the halacha, that it's not something which you can rationalize. Why this we have to give up our life, this we don't have to give up our life. It's all the same. It's all about idolatry. And the end of last week we explained that it does reflect the weight. In other words, the fact is that Torah does give categories to certain sin. This is called a light, and this is called a heavier sin. And we see it by the consequences, by the punishments. One has death penalty, one has the death penalty, the capital punishment, one has Karis, which means in the heaven, they would take a person away earlier in his life, maybe 50 or 60, and so on, or then someone gets the strap and someone doesn't even get the strap. It's a violation. He has to do tshuva, doesn't get the strap, or he has to bring a carbon and so on, which means we see from the consequences the consequences of the sins tell us about the gravity of the sin itself. So it doesn't exist. The Alter Rebbe wiping away the whole notion of the categories of sin. The Alter Rebbe says no. When you're standing in front of the sin, in the eye of the Jew, based on all this explanation, it's all about Avodah, it's all about idolatry. It reflects, the categories of sin reflects after the sin. Once chas v'sholom, someone did violate, God forbid, advertently or inadvertently, he violated. After the sin, then you go back, you retrieve to the gravity of the sin. You see, what kind of sin was it? It was a consequence karis, was a consequence that he is cut away, he is snipped away, he is cut off from the source of his energy, which is God, which is Elokim Chaim, which is the God of life. Because Eden through Torah mitzvahs vatam adveikim b'Hashem Elokechem, we are connected, we cleave to the God, the Elokim Chaim, to the life of, to Hashem, which is called Elokim Chaim, which is the source of life, true life. Chaim Amitim. And Rachmanos, when someone does a sin, he cuts away, like we explained last week with a few examples of a chandelier, etc. So then, if it's not a karis, and that's what happens, a karis unfortunately manifests in the physical world as well, that his life is, God forbid, can be cut short as well as a result, but namely, it's a problem beyond the surface. In other words, this is already a manifestation, this is already an extension, how that it manifests as well in this physical world. But what's really happening is, unfortunately, the sin, like he explained, when Kodesh Baruch Hu punishes, or tells us about a punishment in the Torah, that itself tells us how deep the blemish has penetrated. And if the blemish is penetrated, or the gravity of the blemish is so profound, that as a result the person cut himself away, so it starts on the spiritual realm. It's namely on the spiritual realm that his neshama was cut away from his creator through that sin. Consequently, the fact that it reflected and it materializes, or it becomes manifest in this physical world, it's already a result, a consequence, a derivative of the way it is in the spiritual realm, which there is the great significance of the connection of the neshama and HaKadosh Baruch Hu, or the spiritual realm referring to the neshama's connection, or this, God forbid, this connection with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The Alter Rebbe says, what if it's a sin that doesn't have karis? That is where, in other words, that category of this, or the categorizing the sin as a Aveda Kala. In other words, that category of the sin being Aveda Kala reflects after the one chas v'sholom violated. Can he reconnect? So Alter Rebbe says, if it wasn't a sin that has associated, or its consequences karis, yes, he can immediately connect. His animal soul can connect. His body, which executed the sin, could reestablish, connect to the soul, which the soul is always part and aligned with the Spirit of God. And this is where we were holding. Again, you can see in the previous classes, just to follow up till these very words where we were holding over here, it could reconnect to the kedusha, to the sanctity of the nefesh elokis, of the godly soul. He does say in the Haggah, in the note over here, based on we noted this, we touched upon this last week as well, but to point out, based on the blemish of the soul, and the way it's, again, in the source of the soul in the highest levels, that's how much the cleansing process exists in this physical world as well. The whole, and the punishment, how it unfolds, or how it reflects in purgatory, in Gehenna. Each sin, a particular punishment, because the punishment is not just something which is not, it's not just an extrinsic idea where Hashem just stop. Okay, give him this punishment. I have a few other punishments. Let's try to just allocate or distribute the punishments based on the sin. No, every sin, its punishment is precise to that sin, because it is the unique. Let's say you need a certain soaps or certain liquids in order to uproot a deeper stain. That punishment, the reason why it's so, that is the material or the action which would cleanse in the neshama from that particular blemish, which was unfortunately accomplished, or the neshama was impacted by that particular sin. So each one in this world, in the world to come, and so on, because and he says even in the heavenly Misa b'dei shamayim and kares, not every sin also has the same type of blemish. So it's all based on the the Shefet Kol Haaretz, which is Hashem. He is the true judge. How he decided, and he wrote it in the Torah, what Chman al sin deserves, what punishment, etc. We hope HaKadosh Baruch Hu forgives us, and we do tshuva, and he's able to, like we say, like we ask HaKadosh Baruch Hu, please forgive us without any infliction of pain, and so on. The way he knows how to, that's why he's God. But we're talking about the way it's laid out for us in Torah. So now getting back to the sin which doesn't have kares, Alter Rebbe says this is where the reflection. This is where it reflects the Aveda Kala. Now, when you're standing in front of Aveda, every Aveda may be considered and categorized as Aveda Kala, a light sin. It's all Aveda Zar, it's all idolatry. We have to make sure to stay completely away or be careful. Be scrupulously careful with any sin, even Aveda Kala, because every Aveda Kala one separates himself from the Kedusha, because you don't know other does an unprecedented separation, like the Alter Rebbe explained and elaborated in this chapter, and based on the previous chapters. Expanded on this in this chapter. But after the sin, if it's not a sin which have kares, and this is where we stop, that his body and his nefesh, his body rather, and his animal soul, which executed the sin, could reattach itself to the spirit and the sanctity, the spirit of sanctity of the godly soul, which was always, that's what he says, v'gam hamamina, which always believes in Hashem Echad. What happened was, as we said, it's not like you can't separate, like we give an example, someone says, well, with the godly soul I serve God, with the animal soul I do animalistic stuff, sins, etc. Doesn't exist. The godly soul is invested in the animal soul. When the animal soul sins, it pulls the godly soul, which is a chelik kamimal, which is essentially a part of God. That's what the soul is. So he's pulling the godly energy into the area of impurity. Imagine the great pain where the nefesh elokis endures, the godly soul endures as it's pulled into the sin. But after the sin, and this is where we're holding, the animal soul as well, the body which ultimately executed the sin, could reconnect, because there's no kares. There was no complete disconnect. There was no kares. There was no punishment of kares, which means this sin, there's an easier ability. There is an ability rather for the neshama to ease it, to again its connection, regain its connection to the sanctity of the godly soul, which is invested in the animal soul into the body. Hamamina b'Hashem Echad, which always believes in the oneness of Hashem. Alter Rebbe adds, famous expression, Alter Rebbe, Gam b'shas achet toisa b'amnita, even at the time of sin, the nefesh elokis was enormous pain, because it was pulled into something which is so antithetical to what it stands for or is. It's part of God. And it entered into areas, every sin brings the neshama into areas which are extremely ungodly, impure. This is the lowest level of sin, is the lowest level of impurity. So nefesh elokis is very much in pain, but it never lost and always maintained its sense of godliness, or its sense of being a godly soul, which is always aligned with and always maintains its 100% faith in Hashem Echad, because it is part of the experience of Hashem Echad. It is a chelik kamimal. It's painful, but nonetheless, even b'shas achet, in the time of sin, when it was pulled into the worst areas, it was still ba'amna ite, with faith and integrity with its Creator, with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. This is a famous expression. It says that Esther, famous based on the pasuk in Megillah Esther, that Esther, wherever she was in the worst places. She was in the palace of Achashverosh. She was always had that sense of the trust or the integrity with Mordechai, wherever she was. Mordechai was her guide, was her leader, and wherever she was, ba'amna ite, she was always stood with aminut, with trust and integrity with Mordechai. The same thing. This is even the neshama. Even b'shas achet, in the time of sin, when it was pulled into this whole experience, it was ba'amna ite, with complete integrity with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, because it is a part of, it's a chelik kamimal, it's a neshama elokis, it's a godly soul. It was in a state of exile. And what's the point of exile? You take someone, you put him in a place where he doesn't want to be. That's the definition of exile. The neshama was in a state of exile, teich nefesh bahamis, within the animal soul, which the animal soul is associated with Sitra Achra. From the world of Sitra Achra, which means from the spirit of impurity, hamachtiyo es haguf, which makes the body sin, umeridosi imo be'im kishael, and it brings it together with it into the depth of the abyss, which is the lamata mato, double lashon, lamata mato tachas tumas hasitra achra klips avodah zara, under, lower than the spirit of Tumah and the Klippa, which is Avodah Zarah. As we said before, that the Klippa, we mentioned that the notion of a Yid sinning, that experience, or the level which he unfortunately reaches and touches, is a level which is lower than the spirit of impurity which persuaded him to sin. Because the spirit of impurity which persuaded him to sin ultimately, to some degree, subtly, is aligned with its creator, because that's its mandate, to persuade a person to sin. Conversely, the Jew doesn't have any mandate like that. Quite on the contrary. The mandate of the Jew is not to sin. And he violates that. He means to say that the experience or the area of sin in the face of the area, the experience of sin, is lower and more impure than the whole structure of Tumah and Sitra Achra, the spirit of Tumah and Sitra, the Sitra Achra and the Klippa, the Tumah of Avodah Zarah. And the Alter Rebbe says, Hashem yishmereinu, God should forsake us and save us. And that's where Rachmana litzlan, the neshama, is taken, is pulled, when the person, God forbid, executes a sin. We don't have a greater exile. How the neshama has to plunge, or plunges mi'igra rama, from the highest mountain, which is expressed in the Zohar a few times, igra rama lebira miktot, from the highest mountain to the lowest of valleys. The plunge is enormous, and we can't think of a greater exile than that. Like we said before, explained before, the Sheirosh Hamokar Neshama is called Beis Yisrael, the source, the root of the nefashis, which means the nefesh, of every single yid comes from Chochmah, love, from the supreme Chochmah of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Hashem and His wisdom are essentially one. So he's basically taking God Himself, the sanctity, the kedusha, the kodesh hakadoshim, the holy of God Himself, and pulling God, His energy, into this most impure, unprecedentedly impure area. I use that term based on what the Alter Rebbe explained before. Hu kimashal, it's similar. Ha'eches bereisha shel melech. He comes into a palace and he grabs the head of the king, not any other place, the head of the king, and he pulls it, meride lemato, and he pulls it down. He brings it into a bathroom and he puts the head of the king into a wastebasket, whatever it would be called today, the normal name, malitzea, a wastebasket. Not that it's an empty wastebasket, a wastebasket which is full of waste. It wasn't down. The waste is there, and he pulls the head of the king into that area. There's no greater shame which can, by definition, exist than executing such an action. Taking the head of the king, people would be tremble even to come close to a king. The king evokes awe, reverence, and so on and so forth. And he goes over, takes the head of the king, pulls it into the bathroom, puts the head of the king into the wastebasket when the wastebasket is full. That is exactly what transpires when a person does an Aveda. Because the head of the king, we all possess the head of the king. We all have a neshama, which a neshama is a chelik kamimal, which means it's a part of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That's the source and root of every single neshama, of every single yid. And this neshama is invested in the nefesh bahamis, in the animal soul. So when we execute, we allow the nefesh bahamis to fall prey, or we allow the nefesh bahamis to express itself with its passion, with its execution of the, together with the body, executing the sin. We're pulling the kodesh hakadoshim, the holy of holies of God, into areas which is the worst and lowest level of impurity. And Alter Rebbe concludes the chapter, even he does it for a few moments. Because let's say someone is very respectful to the king throughout, But a moment here, he grabs the king, puts it into the wastebasket. A moment there, he does it every 2 weeks even. For a moment, not for a long time, just for a few seconds. The shame is the same. And that's why a person could say, well, just a moment here I sin, and here I sin, and here I sin, not on any frequent basis, periodically. And even I sin just a moment here, a moment there. You think about it with this analogy, it's a moment here, a moment there. The shame is the same. As we know, and Alter Rebbe says, it's not just that I'm giving you this term just as an example, just to magnify this whole notion of sin. He says you should know that the klipas sitra achra, the level, it's in other places it's written clearly in the description of the impure forces are nikroim. They're called kitzaya. They're called waste. So because they're called waste, it's not just like a external, foreign analogy that I'm giving you over here. This is the truth, and because it's the truth, like it's known, and therefore we have to imagine it exactly in the same way. And just like to us, it's the most unthinkable thing one would ever do, and the most shameful thing one can think of doing, to take the head of the king and pull it forcefully into a wastebasket full of waste. That's the approach the person should and would have on sin. That it's because he has a chelik alikamimal, because his neshama is part of God, and then the source of neshama is the Eibishter Hashem Himself. And the neshama nefesh is not separated from the animal soul; it's invested in the animal soul. When the animal soul it expresses its passionate, animalistic desires and so on in the context of sin, together with the body, they ultimately pull the godly soul into these areas, which is tantamount to this analogy. And again, namely, as the Alter Rebbe says, they're really called kitzay. It's truly, they're really, the spirit of impurity is truly called the wastebasket, etc. Therefore, we have to understand how careful we have to be, chas v'shalom, not to sin, and again, similarly to be, even though the emphasis over here, the leisesa, things which not to do, things we're prohibited to do, the Alter Rebbe will even take it further, how much we have to be careful as well in the mitzvahs hasei, those mitzvahs which we are commanded to do. Have a great night.